Hey guys, welcome. Thought I would make a quick video. As you can see, I am a gun collector, but my collection is sort of niche in that I only collect pistols, European police and military pistols from the 1980s and 1990s. Why do I love that stuff so much? Well, I think it was just sort of a product of my upbringing. I was obsessed with guns as a teenager back in the early 80s. And although I liked the 1911s and the revolvers that we typically saw here in the United States, I was always sort of drawn to these newer European pistols that started having greater magazine capacity and things like that, unique controls, double action, single action options that we normally didn't get here in the United States. About the only thing we could find in the 70s, I would say, would be like a Smith & Wesson Model 39 or something. But everybody knows those had some issues and were not the most reliable pistols in the world, although they're neat in their own right. Not knocking Smith & Wesson. But I would get my hands on every piece of reading material I could find at the library, at the bookstore, all these, gun books, gun magazines, things like that. Shotgun News, of course, was always a great resource. And I always just found myself being drawn towards the new European Wonder Nines at the time. Everybody, if you were alive at the time, you'll know that, the 45 and the 38 revolver, or 357 revolver, I should say, that sort of dominated things in the military and police world, especially the United States at the time. The Europeans were starting to go in a different direction, as they always kind of have, as far as handguns in particular. They were usually smaller caliber too. And there's nothing wrong with 9mm, of course. Now pretty much everybody across the world has adopted 9mm as a standard military and police cartridge. We've gone through several iterations here in the U.S., going from 45 and then to 9mm, then to 40 caliber, somewhere in between, and now we're sort of back on 9mm. Who knows what'll be next, but I have a feeling we'll probably eventually go back to 9mm. So why do I like these so much? Like I said before, I've always been sort of driven towards the European stuff, particularly in the 1980s. The first one that I ever saw come on the scene was the Sig P220. And the 220, the ones that we saw in the United States anyway, were labeled actually not as Sig-Sauer, but as Browning. They were imported by Browning from Sig-Sauer. And just a quick backstory on how Sig-Sauer came about. Sig was actually a Swiss company and was making the 220 under their military name. It was actually a 9mm originally. So it was a full-size, single-stack 9mm pistol. And at the time, it was something really new. No military was using a pistol with a built-in decocker, and it had a couple of other interesting features that others did not have. So it quickly gained popularity in Europe, and a lot of shooters in the U.S. wanted to try it, so they imported them as the P220, made by Sig-Sauer, but imported through Browning. I know it's confusing, but it eventually, once the guns started coming in and everybody knew that it was something special, Sig-Sauer gained an importer and started importing them under the name Sig-Sauer. So Sig was a Swiss company. It was a Swiss firearms company. But Switzerland has some really, really odd export laws when it comes to firearms. So they partnered with J.P. Sauer in Germany, and hence the company Sig-Sauer was formed. It was a partnership. They were making these 220s originally, and several European militaries bought them in 9mm. And again, most of the ones that came to the United States were in 45 ACP because that's what we're used to, like I said in the beginning of the video. There were a lot of people that liked 1911s but did not want to carry a semi-automatic pistol because of the perceived safety issues with having to lower hammer and things like that. The decocker alleviate that. If you don't know what a decocker is, basically if the firearm is cocked and you're finished shooting, as opposed to having a light trigger with the hammer back, all you have to do is basically release this lever and the hammer comes forward safely, I should say. There's no way it's going to go off doing that, in other words, as opposed to a 1911 where you have to sort of gently ride the hammer down. Makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So That was sold as a safety feature in the U.S. And the fact that it was 45, people were familiar with it. So it had a 7 or 8 round magazine. Not a huge magazine capacity, but at the time that was not a thing. That did not come around until the famous 226. Now everybody's familiar with the 226 because of its provenance with the U.S. Navy, the Navy SEALs, and all that sort of thing. But before any of that, lots of European agencies were using this. The Germans, the Special Ops police forces in Germany were using this. Of course, the German military at the time, the British SAS was using this. So it was quickly gaining popularity. Basically, the 226 improved on the original 220, but actually gave it a double stack magazine. So now, as opposed to having 8 rounds magazine capacity, now you had 15 plus one in the chamber is 16. And that quickly took off as being the most popular option at the time. Of course, everybody wanted more rounds. And if you read a lot of gun publications back in the day, a term started coming out called a Wonder Nine. All these companies, especially out of Europe, were coming out with these new innovative designs that were all sort of wrapped around a large double stack 9mm magazine, and hence the Wonder Nines. And I'll include in that, like the Beretta 92, that was considered to be a Wonder Nine. A couple of offerings from Walther, etc. But to improve upon the 226, a lot of people said, hey, we'd love to have a compact version of a 226. And what they came up with is what I consider to be one of the best Sig-Sauer pistols that has ever been made, and that is the 228. The 228 differs with the 226 a little bit in that it's a little bit shorter, so it's a little bit less printy, I'll just say. If you were going to carry it concealed, it does conceal under a shirt a little bit better. Holds 13 rounds as opposed to 15 rounds. Slide is a little bit shorter, has this rounded trigger guard versus the squared off trigger guard. But other than that, internally, they use a lot of the same parts. In fact, most of these SIGs, whether it be at the 220 or the 228 or the 226 or even the 225 that I'll talk about in just a minute, use a lot of the same internal parts. Which is something I really like. And, as far as a collector goes, somebody who does maintenance on all these, by the way, I shoot all these. I don't have anything that is such a safe queen that I can't shoot it. Although, I will have to admit that this nickel 228 is about as close to a safe queen as you're going to get. These are extremely rare, getting very hard to find now. And speaking of that, when the announcement was made a few years back that Sig-Sauer in Germany was going to be basically shuttering their doors. They're not going to be making these pistols anymore. I saw the writing on the wall and scarfed up a couple more that I'd been hunting after, this being one of them. I have been looking for a nickel 228 for a long time. And if you're a collector in the SIG world, that these prices that these command now are they're getting ridiculous. Sometimes over $2,000, which is crazy for a pistol. I paid nowhere near that amount of money, but I got it while the getting was good, as they say. But in addition to these two, Sig made an offering that the German police used, and it is the Sig 225. The Sig 225 is basically a single stack copy of the original 220 that was in the one that I talked about that was in 45 with a single stack magazine. But this is a 9mm. It's a single, oops, I had a 228 accident there, sorry. The 225 is a single stack. Again, it holds 7 rounds. It's a very thin, very small profile, great concealed carry gun. It does have this squared off trigger. The trigger on these is not as great as a 226 or 228. I'll be the first to admit that. But this is a great carry option. And a lot of the guns that have been imported lately were imported surplus German police pistols. And a lot of times you'll see those marked as P6. Again, still made by Sig-Sauer. A couple little different specs. There's a different little bobbed hammer here, and a couple other markings are different. But in essence, it's the same gun. As far as collectors go, the commercial versions are considered to be the better pieces as far as collectability goes. And simply for the fact that a lot of the surplus police guns were used a lot, many, many, many decades of service before they finally let go of them. But the 225 is a great option as well. In addition to all those, they actually made a very compact pistol for detectives and people that wore, plain clothes every day, people that had a need to conceal firearms, and that is the 230. It looks very much like a Walther PPK, but if you'll notice, it also has a decocker, just like all the other SIGs. This particular one, 230, is chambered in 32 ACP, which is a very weird cartridge for SIG. You don't see a lot of them. This one actually has a lanyard loop on the side. I think a special run of these were made for the Japanese National Police, and a few of those were imported in the U.S. that were basically overruns. I've heard anywhere between 200 and 500 of these exist, but if you can ever find a magazine for these in 32, grab it, because they're extremely hard to find and very valuable. Because of the popularity of the 228, and by the way, if you ever wrap your hands around one of these, it fits the hand just perfectly, at least it does mine. And I have a lot of trigger time on the P228. This was probably the first pistol that I really, really wanted. And when I first got my real job, this was the first gun that I wanted to buy, the 228, just because to me it was so iconic at the time. It eventually took on the persona in the United States as being the quintessential Fed gun, in that pretty much every three-letter agency you can think of was carrying one at the time. And frankly, I carried one in that same capacity for many, many years myself. So I have a lot of trigger time on the SIG 228 and the 226 as well. Eventually, the 9mm sort of fell out of favor with military and law enforcement circles, in the United States at least. And the new up-and-comer that was coming along, the SIG 357, as well as the 40 caliber Smith & Wesson. And SIG decided, hey, let's make something the exact same size as the 228, but let's make it beefier with a beefier slide. It was the first milled slide that SIG made, and that actually turned into be this, which is the SIG 229. The 229 is a heavy little piece for the same size as the 228, but again, it's a much thicker milled slide to take the chamber pressures of 40 caliber Smith & Wesson and 357 SIG. If you're not familiar with 357 SIG, it is a incredibly high velocity round. Basically, if you miss somebody, you'd probably scorch their eyebrows off with the muzzle blast. But I'm joking, of course. But the 229, sorry, I have to get my numbers right. The 229 is an excellent pistol in its own right. This particular one is well broken in. That's one thing I want to talk about, sort of the elephant in the room with SIG. The triggers are not great out of the box, and it does take quite a bit of breaking in time for these triggers to get smooth. There are some things you can do with spring tension, but I have found the best thing to do is just completely disassemble the firearm, lubricate all the parts, and you're halfway there. The rest of it comes just with getting out on the range and actually shooting them. And they do break in very nicely. They become very smooth shooting guns, very accurate guns, I might add. So anyway, on this channel, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the polymer modern guns that are around. I do own a few, and I'll make a joke about them every now and then about Glocks or something, but the reality is that is the world we live in now. That is where the firearms industry is going, and these will be going by the wayside. So as a collector, when you see one, think about that. They're never going to make stuff like this again. They're just too expensive to make. And that's another reason why I like them. But the main thing is, the nostalgia of it, that particular time period to me, they will always have a special place in my heart, this era of Sig-Sauer. So next time, I'm going to get into detail on these models individually, and we'll talk about them. So until the next time, Retro Pistol out.